Yeah, so a week or two ago, the Treasury announced sanctions against the SVR for SolarWinds,
Yeah.
which is immediately interesting to me because typically offensive cyber operations are done by either GRU or FSB. But I think it's the first time I've seen sanctions for cyber espionage.
It depends on your definition of cyber espionage, as with so many other things. But we have a long and storied history of engaging in sanctions when it comes to Russian espionage in this country. Part of the reason why is sanctions like this are done by executive order. And yet many times, and part of the reason for that is Congress is very bad at reacting quickly to the need for sanctions in terms of Russian espionage. And this tracks back to the mid-war period between World War I and World War II, when the Russian intelligence apparatus completely penetrated our military industrial complex and especially our aviation industry. There was an entire jet developed by Boeing that was absolutely completely shipped to Russia and built in parts before we had a chance to do it here in the US. That was done actually by Alger Hiss. This is pretty famous and so our strategy in terms of Russian espionage has been either executive action or delayed and underwhelming congressional action over the course of the last 70, 80 years. So cyber espionage isn't special. It's just another way of saying wired espionage or human intelligence. I think people are calling it the first act of sanctions in terms of cyber espionage just because it's the first time it made the news like this. So there's no fundamental difference between a foreign country listening in over, AWS clouds, over, a supply chain attack like SolarWinds, or now we're calling it Sunburst, I guess, and listening in over AT&T or listening in over radio waves. There's no fundamental, like, emotional, moral, or legal difference. It's just, it made a lot of news.
Often, one of the things I'll see is we have spies like sneaking into wherever, listening to whatever. But then when SolarWinds happened, everyone's like, this is an act of war. This is a declaration of war against the US. And it's like, it feels like when the espionage is done on computers, people think about it differently than just regular espionage, which is interesting.
I think it's because it scares them. Like,
I
it's
think
something
so.
that they're not familiar with. They're not as in tune with some of the technology. So it's a lot more foreign to them and they don't know how to control it. And that's what's scary.
In mid-February, I had an article come out in Brookings very specifically on why SolarWinds was not an act of war, and very specifically noting that the appropriate response to espionage is sanctions. We have a lot of different options in a big toolkit there with sanctions. And the problem with calling this an act of war is that it not only legally wasn't, it falls in a storied and frankly dull and predictable history of espionage among foreign countries. The idea that it's an act of war is it's unfortunate because it really is about thinking that computers are somehow magic or different. They're not. They're just sand that we tricked into thinking with a little bit of electricity. They're just a communications device. That's all.
Yeah, I tweeted a meme and got a lot of backlash for it. It was the butterfly meme, the guy with the butterfly, like, is this a bird?
Yeah.
So it was
Yeah.
that, and it's espionage, comma, but with computers, and it's the guy doing, is this cyber war? But
And no, it's really not.
yeah.
We heard some of the same things with the election and all the disinformation too. Disinformation has been around since probably the beginning of time, and it's definitely been noted over the last few centuries.
I mean, it was called propaganda, and they renamed it, and suddenly
Exactly.
it's a new thing.
But since it's done digitally and since social media is so much more prominent, all of a sudden it's this new horrible thing that we need to cause a war over. And
it is literally the disinformation hasn't just existed since the beginning of time. It's literally how Julius Caesar came to power in ancient Rome. He wrote his own propaganda on the Gallic Wars, commentaries on the wars in Gaul. This is literally his own disinformation and propaganda that he was running a media campaign for. This is how we handle power, unfortunately. And disinformation, propaganda, when you're not trying to get a $50 million grant from somebody, propaganda and espionage are not only fundamentally different from each other, they're very different from an act of warfare. You must cross over into a human being being harmed in order for it to become an act of cyber war. You can do that with a power grid, with a water supply, with a water supply plant. You can do that when you're harming people and denying them access to healthcare right? But you can't do that by just listening. Nobody suffered $1 of damage, or so much as went without their daily coffee in the
Yeah.
SolarWinds attack.
I mean, a lot of us went without our daily coffee, but for different
Well,
reasons.
yeah, some of us
But
had more that day.
yeah,
Yeah.
that was more than being woken up at 5 in the morning to deal with stuff. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, like one of the main arguments I've seen repeatedly is it's kind of the misunderstanding of mens rea. It's the it could have happened. They weren't intending for that to happen. They didn't try to make that happen, but it could have happened. Therefore, it's an act of war. And I've even seen this argument from Congress people. They've been like, we need to retaliate against this because while they didn't cause harm or damage, they could have. And I think personally that that is a bullshit argument, but it's one that seems to be very popular even within the government.
I think that the law, not a lawyer, but the law has gotten to a point where everything is so nuanced, can be taken so many different ways because we want loopholes and we want ways to interpret things the ways that we want to, that it's like Marcus said, it's getting kind of diluted. It's hard to tell what is actually a crime and what's not. And I think that's becoming really difficult for people.
It's the international equivalent of prosecutorial overreach, which none of us in this conversation would have any idea about. So it is very much that, right? Like the thing that the person did or didn't do might have caused a larger problem. And it is our fear of that larger problem that makes us want to stomp down on someone rapidly. The problem is that if Russia wanted to cause the United States kinetic damage in an actual act of cyber war, we've already seen that happen. It's already literally existed. This is what happened when the US supplies of food, logistics, prescription medication, pharmaceuticals were halted in 40% of the world's shipping, coming to a dead halt in 2017 with NotPetya. That was an act of cyber war, right? This is Russia attacking the Ukrainian power grid and the actual worm escaping, shutting down Maersk shipping around the world. That's 40% of global shipping. In comparison, I've called the Ever Given, the Suez Canal ship that stuck in the Suez Canal 2 weeks or possibly 17 years ago at this point in the news cycle. It shut down 12% of global shipping. That's 27% of a NotPetya. And we're all super obsessed with this one cute ship and memeing it in the middle of the Suez Canal. In reality, this kind of cyber war, this kind of cyber attack has happened, and it was kinetic and it was done by Russia. It did affect the United States. And you know what? We weren't that worried about it then because it wasn't as visible. That's
yeah,
why.
it was the same with WannaCry. Is once it came out that WannaCry was North Korea, there was no outrage. There was no, this is cyber war. This is an act of war. We need to invade them. But for some reason under SolarWinds, like everything changed. Like NotPetya was ignored, WannaCry was ignored, but suddenly now, because they hacked some random obscure supply chain company, we need to go to war with Russia.
Yeah, well, WannaCry. So a few of us have been calling WannaCry an act of war for a period of time. But yeah, you're right. The attention is not there. And it has to do, I think, with the rapid forgetting of what it looks like to experience that kind of attack. And SolarWinds, for some reason, it's not going away in people's minds. They feel more harmed by it. Right? I don't know what it is. It's like some kind of team effort kind of thing. Like our team got hit, maybe. I'm not sure.
I can see two kind of, I guess, explanations for that. One of them is, I don't want to say everything's politically charged, but over the last few years, everything has become much more politically charged. The split is very obvious. There is a large schism between the different parties. And I think there's a lot of distrust between parties, and that's causing people to want to lash out and make rash decisions in order to, fortify what they believe. But also, I think the fact that SolarWinds, when people hear supply chain and power grid and stuff like that, they get scared. They forget that those things are connected to computers. Everything's connected to a computer at this point. And just, it's not something that people think of being able to be exploited. And I think that really scares people too.
One thing I did, my dad actually pointed out, was the SolarWinds was on the news like 24/7 in England. When Hafnium happened, nothing. No one had heard about it. And there's not really any real difference between these other than the fact supply chain is the buzzword of the decade now. And because it was a supply chain attack, it got so much more media coverage than really anything else.
It's
Agreed.
scary. I mean, when I do my stuff with medical devices, people are terrified. They're like, I didn't even think of, hospital systems or, connected medical devices or anything like that being able to be exploited. And I think it's just that feeling that they're realizing that everything's connected and they can't do anything about it. I think that's part of the, backlash.
That cold moment of the ice water pouring down your spine that I think so many people in cybersecurity have had at this point. I remember that moment when I realized that the world was built on baling twine and chewing gum and how insecure the world was. And it was at my first DEF CON almost a decade ago at this point, when I'd been in security for a period of time, and nobody told me I was in information security, but I was doing web application security, like at Microsoft Game Studios. Nobody told me that that's what I was doing, but I was in the industry for a period of time. The first time I had that realization, that kind of sick ice water, holy shit realization, was I picked a lock. And this is common for a lot of people. I picked a 1-pin lock, and then I picked a 2-pin lock, and then I picked a 3-pin lock. And then it's like the light bulb goes on in your head, and the hasp comes open on the padlock, and you're like, this is what's standing between me and all the bad guys outside my house. And I feel like so many people outside cybersecurity with SolarWinds are starting, and with the medical devices you're talking about, they're starting to realize for the first time how thin the veil is between them and someone with bad intentions, right?
I think it comes back to people not understanding it. People are scared of what they don't understand. So, I mean, a lock, you look at it and you're like, okay, I understand how that works. But like, they don't know how to protect themselves from certain things technology wise, and that terrifies them.
Yeah, it was an interesting thing to see, like the general public's opinions of SolarWinds. Like half of Twitter was like, we need to go to war with Russia.
I know.
One thing I did notice that was very interesting was the White House announced they were going to retaliate, which is a strange thing because you don't typically retaliate for espionage. That's not what espionage is for. Espionage is for gathering data. If you retaliate for espionage, that is war. Like that's an attack. And they came out and they said they were going to, I think the words were something, they were going to do a thing, and Putin would know what the thing was. They weren't very specific. And then they walked that back. They said, actually, we've decided not to retaliate. We're just going to do sanctions, which I thought was interesting. And I'd like to know what exactly went on there.
I would have just gone in and stolen the picture of him riding a bear shirtless from the hotel.
Don't you already have that blown up to a poster in your house like normal human beings?
Can't tell the public that.
Can't tell the public that. Yeah. No, the nature of it is that retaliate. So this is the interesting thing. In the 4 years of the previous administration, words didn't mean things.
Yep.
Words have started to mean things again, which thank God, because it validates the concept of process and of doing things with deliberation and thought in advance when words mean things. Retaliate means something very different than engage in sanctions or sanctioning Russia. In foreign policy, in the history of foreign policy, you're signaling something very different when you describe retaliation versus sanctions. Retaliation is something that happens when there is, you might call it a kinetic effect. Engaging in sanctions has to do with very specifically economic pain that you're attempting to cause to the elite economic leadership of a country, as opposed to retaliation, which often is faced towards a military objective. So there's a reason why it wasn't. I think everybody is just trying to get used to the idea that words mean things again.
I think also. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, please go ahead.
I think also that people don't fully understand the word espionage. I mean, they think they do, but when people think espionage, they think James Bond, and James Bond's form of espionage is retaliatory. So I can see why people would be confused, because that's really the only exposure a lot of people have had to that term.
Yeah, from what I've given to understand of many of my friends who come out of the IC, there's a great deal of thought and care put into a lot of this, but the idea of being a field, and now I want to just note, I'm the child of 2 spies. My parents met in the Army Security Agency. They met at the Defense Language Institute in Monterey, California. They both learned German. They both got posted to East Berlin. My dad was a microwave tower operator, and mom, who outranked him and was in fact someone who operated in the field. We don't know what she did. Her stuff's never going to be declassified. After 25 years, my dad could tell me what he did. But I'm the child of two people who were in the IC, and frankly, there is a tiny number of people who are engaged in like field work as opposed to analysis. And honestly, it's very much sort of like cybersecurity, where 99% of our day is incredibly dull. And then 1% of it is totally terrifying. That's basically what that's like. Most of it is analysis. Most of it is dull, specialized analysis. And you have to talk with and work with other people to make anything sensible really happen. There's no such thing really as like kind of that standalone, send them in and get the job done, James Bond kind of person. There just isn't.
I mean, if the US wants like some sort of James Bond person, they can call me. I'm down to I'm down to go drive an Aston Martin and shoot at things. I'm cool with that.
It makes me wonder if maybe they came out and they jumped the gun saying they were going to retaliate, and then someone explained to the administration what the US is currently doing in Russia and China and to their own allies and to themselves, and they were like, oh shit, yeah, we've hacked a lot of things, maybe we shouldn't be retaliating for hacking.
I think part of it was a knee-jerk reaction too, just because there had been so much non-action with the last administration.
Well, there's a way to accomplish many of our objectives involving sanctions that also, let's not forget, this is a complicated response. It's intended to be a complex response with a lot of different variable sliders. We can do things like halt the export of complex parts for the Russian satellite industry, right? Like that can be part of the conversation and part of the basket of responses. One of the nice things about it, with words beginning to mean things more, is that a skilled administration full of people who are trying to do the right thing and are paying attention to how this gets calculated means that they're going to try to reduce the impact on civil society, on scientists, on people that are trying to build goodwill. You can have great power competition between the elites of two countries while acknowledging that I've got friends in Russia, right? We've got friends, and this is a global industry, a global community of people. And we can acknowledge that there are parts of governments that behave badly over time, and that we need to train behavior, not only in other countries, but in our own. And I like to think of the incoming administration as a correction by the American people in terms of training the behavior of our government to behave appropriately, right? We gotta start having a more sophisticated response to sophisticated problems. So that's where I find myself on that one. Got my let me know when we want to have a conversation about how thin the world is again, because I am sitting here with my my bypass, and part of the reason I do this and have this conversation with how easy it is to pop open padlocks is this is one of the most common brands, right? So it's nice to have that conversation to explain to people we don't pick locks anymore, we just bypass them. There's no, you don't have to develop complex, sophisticated exploits, an O-Day for one system out there in the middle of the world. You can cause just as much chaos by probabilistically creating a world where, people are afraid of a 22% or a 34% of the systems affected hack. You don't have to do that sophisticated single attack. One person who knows how to put their stuff together on GitHub can do the exact same thing just by understanding the concept of a bypass. That's that simple, right? So it makes me annoyed and also afraid when people think that this is about James Bond or about a sophisticated, like it's like a James Bond thing, or that somehow we're going to, appropriately retaliate by with this. It's too complex. It's too complex a situation. And if you don't acknowledge the complexity of the situation, you start doing things that unintentionally end up starving people at borders instead of targeting the people who actually created the policies. And that is annoying and morally inappropriate. I have feelings, so many feelings. So, but I'm a girl in foreign policy. What do you expect?
So a question about cyber sanctions. Why have we not tried to impose something similar against North Korea? Do we not have the same
You can't sanction North Korea.
We don't have any ties to them.
Yeah,
they're
that's what I figured.
Deeply sanctioned at this point that there is absolutely nothing we can do.
Nothing left to sanction.
Yeah,
There's
like
nothing
that's
left to take away.
That's the reason North Korea is so bad, is because they have nothing to lose. there is nothing to stop them from hacking banks and just taking all the money, or launching WannaCry, because there is physically nothing we can do short of actually invading them.
Last year, North Korea, according to the United Nations, stole over $600 million worth, $600 million worth in cybercrime. They've got military arms of the military that are dedicated to cybercrime in North Korea.
Unfortunately, the majority of your healthcare attacks are coming from them, and they seem to not really care whether they hurt people, and that's become an issue. So that sucks that they're the ones that we cannot hold anything against right now.
I mean, that's the downside of cyber sanctions, is the more you do them, the more you force the country being sanctioned to innovate outside of those sanctions, at which point they become less effective. And to the point where, like, North Korea they exist with constant sanctions, so they have no reason not to even worry about them.
Mm-hmm. Which is a good reason for us to not penalize Iran to that point, and instead to engage in that kind of civil society responses, because there's an increase in crime and cyber attacks coming from Iran as well. So